Pinellas County Economic Development contracted with actually commissioned a study on the competitiveness of Pinellas County in that very competitive environment of site selection consulting and just the ability to attract, retain, and be able to expand our existing businesses in an environment where every city in the country is wanting exactly the same types of jobs that we're trying to attract and grow. These are small businesses as well as large. The idea is a company that sells their product or service outside the local marketplace and brings new money into the economy. So we've got some experts in that field. The Site Selection Group is an organization that works with private sector companies to identify the best place for their business. And they also work with economic development groups around the country to identify what it is that can make those communities better and more attractive. Today we have a principal of Site Selection Group, Josh Bays. He manages the company's industrial and economic development business practice for Site Selection Group. And he was formerly with Trammell Crow, has a very extensive experience in commercial and industrial real estate and particularly in the consulting and site selection analysis. He's had over 250 global clients in his practice. Some of the biggest and well-known are Amazon, Novartis, Boeing, and Harley-Davidson. Great companies and great jobs for our area. Good experience. Also, we have Chris Schwenden, who's a vice president of Site Selection Group, and he supports that industrial site selection and ED consulting practice. Extensive background in advanced analytics, taking a look at what makes an area good and looking at workforce and business environment, transportation, logistics, economic incentives, and real estate conditions. Prior to being with Site Selection Group, he was with the Economic Development Partnership in North Carolina. And with that, I'm going to bring up the tag team of Josh Bays and Chris Schwenden.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks for having us. I'm entirely too short to stand behind this podium. So I'm a pacer, a little bit of a pacer. My name's Josh Bays. This is my colleague, Chris Schwenden. Appreciate the introduction. It makes us sound a lot more important than we probably really are. Nonetheless, we appreciate your time this morning. So what we're going to talk about, we kind of have two parts to our presentation. We're going to cover the first part, then we're going to have lunch, and then we're going to come back and talk about the second part. So from an agenda perspective, I'm going to spend some time giving you a quick overview of our company, how we approach projects, the lens that we look through, because that's going to be incredibly important when we start talking about the competitive assessment that we conducted for Pinellas County. Part of that is going to kind of be educational of the objectives of corporate site selection projects and what that process looks like. The whole industry of corporate site selection, those that aren't too terribly familiar with it, sometimes find it intriguing because you hear these headlines of companies moving a corporate headquarters to a location or bringing manufacturing jobs back to the U.S. and establishing operations all around the country. But there's a science of how all of that happens and how the site selection process interacts with economic development to make those projects come to fruition. After that, we'll have lunch, and then after we come back from lunch, we'll go through the summary of the results of the competitive assessment that we conducted, give our final impressions and comments, and then hopefully leave some time for a discussion at the end of this, because our objective here is to answer as many questions and for this to be as beneficial for you guys as possible. Before we dive into this, especially when we come back from lunch and we start talking about the results of the competitive assessment that we conducted for Pinellas County, one of the things that I'd like to touch on is whenever we do engagements like this and we give presentations and we start talking about results, the audience tends to focus a little bit more on the weaknesses than the strengths of the region. And that's natural because, right, that's how you elevate yourself. You look at the weaknesses, look at what you can do to improve yourself from a competitiveness perspective of attracting corporate investment. Although we're prepared to talk about that in detail, we certainly don't want that to dominate today's narrative. And the reason is because if I was doing economic development in Pinellas County, I would be very optimistic about the future. There are some unique challenges to attracting and fostering continued corporate investment in Pinellas County, but it's certainly nothing that cannot be overcome. And this is more of an awareness of those challenges. So again, the picture that I'm trying to paint today is certainly one of optimism. About site selection group. So again, we received at the beginning of this a very good overview of the company. I can explain it in a little bit more depth. 90% of our business is working on behalf of companies finding the optimal location for whatever it is that drives their business. For those companies, we offer 3 services. And so if you look at the box on the right side of this slide, you'll see 4 icons there. Those first 3 icons, location advisory, economic incentives, and corporate real estate, those are the services that we provide to our corporate clients. Location advisory, that's all of the consulting, the strategy that goes behind making sure our clients are either locating, relocating, or consolidating to the optimal locations from a geographic perspective. And a lot of stuff goes into that, and we'll talk about this more in detail in just a second. Things like workforce, transportation and logistics, business environment, utilities, infrastructure, real estate, all of those sorts of things. The second service that we provide to our clients is a full slate of economic incentive services. So on behalf of our clients, we're identifying, negotiating, and securing economic incentives, and then even helping with ongoing compliance. And then the third service that we offer are real estate services. So on behalf of our clients, we're identifying, negotiating, performing due diligence on, and securing real estate. And so a typical project for us requires us to integrate all of those into one seamless process, starting from the time a company says we either need to expand, consolidate, or relocate, until the optimal location's chosen and these things are secured. And from a timing perspective, our white-collar type projects, that's probably 8 to 12 months. The industrial side, that can be as long as 18 months. We're headquartered in Dallas. We have 35, that says 29. We actually have 35 employees. And we've been doing this since 2006. Prior to that, the core team, including myself, was with Trammell Crow Company, which at the time was the world's largest development firm. The obligatory slide every single consultant has, right? The logo slide. So the point that we're really trying to get across here is the diversified industry experience. If you look at our project mix, we're kind of split right down the middle of what we call professional services and what we call industrial. Professional services being things like your corporate headquarters, back office, shared service, call center type projects. Industrial being your manufacturing and distribution. Again, as I mentioned, this corporate work makes up 90% of our business. The other 10% of our business is from time to time, we will leverage the services we offer to our corporate clients and provide objective assessments for economic development. That can be regional economic development groups, in this instance, county economic development groups, in some instances, state, as well as utility. Again, this is a minor part of our business, but one that enables us to leverage our corporate experience and kind of offer that perspective to the economic development community. So objectives and site selection process. So when we were engaged by Pinellas County for this competitive assessment, we basically had 3 project objectives. One, we wanted to evaluate Pinellas County's competitive positioning for attracting corporate investment, with a special focus on what we're calling high-impact projects. And so what is a high-impact project? When we think of economic development, from our perspective, we think of it as having the overall goal of not only creating jobs, but elevating the wage base and increasing the tax base. And so when we talk about high-impact projects, it's those projects that are aimed to do just that, especially elevating the wage base and increasing the tax base. So high wages, high capital investment, sophisticated operations, leveraging the post-secondary infrastructure, those sorts of things. The second objective of this was to benchmark Pinellas County from a competitive perspective against what we view as a very competitive set of candidate communities around the United States. That in our judgment, not only would Pinellas County compete with, but the broader Tampa Bay metropolitan area would compete with. So you get kind of a relative sense through our eyes how that ranks. And then the third was identify the strengths and weaknesses of the county as a result of that competitive assessment, and give some slight recommendations on how, in our mind, the county could elevate its competitive positioning from attracting corporate investment. So this slide that you see here, it's relatively dense, I will admit here. What I would really like you to focus your attention on are the bold type right underneath the numbers. To the extent there is a typical process to site selection, this slide captures what that is. I will say, anytime a company is again, expanding, relocating, or consolidating, it's always a unique project. You have to customize the project around their set of circumstances. But if there is a standard approach, this is it. Philosophically, talking about corporate site selection for just a second, the name is actually counterintuitive. The name site selection. Whenever a company chooses a location, they're not selecting a location. Rather, it's a top-down approach where they're starting with everything, all of their options, applying some series of analyses, filters, parameters, eliminating options until they see what comes out the other end of that hopper. So as you'll notice, this process that we employ, and I think this is indicative of much of our competitors, or I know that it is, as well as companies that do this internally, you'll know that it's a top-down approach. And this is consistent across project type, whether it's industrial or professional services or what have you. Just like any consulting engagement starts off with a needs assessment. That's where companies really identify what's going to drive their particular project. And so let's talk about those corporate site selection drivers today, in today's environment, because that's something that changes over time significantly. I mean, the drivers 10 years ago are different than what's driving corporate investment today. The one thing, if you take away anything from anything that we say today, the one thing that I want to stress that drives projects more than anything is the availability of a qualified workforce. If companies cannot staff their operations today, immediately ramp up headcount, and then sustain headcount, leveraging some pipeline of talent into the future, they're not going to be successful. And so more often than not, almost in every engagement, we're prioritizing workforce characteristics over just about anything else. And remember how just a second ago I mentioned that that trends have changed. Well, one changing trend with workforce is cost. In today's environment, now that, in my opinion, the economy's humming along, corporate investment is certainly at its highest point since the Great Recession, one of the things that's happened is the labor market all across the country has tightened. I mean, pick a type of operation. I don't care if it's accountants, I don't care if they're welders, machine operators, financial analysts. You can't find 100 unemployed folks in any market with that skill set just sitting on couches. By and large, most of the people that have an employable skill set are employed, and that's a fact. Now, I'm not saying there's not unemployment, and I'm not saying that there aren't good candidates among the unemployed population, but right now, employment is incredibly tight, and companies are facing significant challenges from a hiring perspective. And essentially what that means is they're placing less of a priority on labor costs than they did when workforce wasn't as tight. And so what I'm saying is companies are more willing to sacrifice workforce costs to be able to staff with the appropriate skill sets. And so moving on down kind of the site selection drivers a little bit, you have things like transportation and logistics, obviously incredibly important for industrial projects, and something unique to this state. I mean, the state of Florida, when you think about it from an industrial perspective, for manufacturing, specifically manufacturing operations, you have to have a compelling reason to operate in Florida. I mean, Florida is a peninsula on the southeast portion of the United States, and so there has to be either some logistics advantage of leveraging a nearby port. There has to be some type of advantage of serving the population bases associated with this part of the country, or there has to be some type of rich skill set here from a workforce perspective that justifies the existence of those types of operations. So going down some of the more site selection drivers: transportation, logistics, business environment, tax climate, regulatory climate, infrastructure, accessibility, utilities, those sorts of things. One of the things that is going to come up when we start talking about the competitive assessment are real estate and economic incentives. Real estate can be a significant site selection driver for a lot of projects, and we'll talk about that. And then the other side of that are economic incentives. Whenever we're doing presentations like this, economic incentives is a topic that a lot of people latch onto. Because when you read those corporate, when you read that Caterpillar just opened that big manufacturing plant, or so-and-so company just relocated their corporate headquarters, the very next line is they received X million dollars in tax credits and what have you. And so the topic of economic incentives is very synonymous with corporate site selection, but I can make a very convincing argument that it is one of the lowest priorities when you're citing a project, and isn't as relevant until you start getting towards the end of this process. And so talking about this process, once drivers, the project drivers are understood, then you employ that top-down approach. You start with a community filtering phase where we essentially take the target geographic area that our client is considering. We take every single county or metropolitan statistical area or whatever geography we choose to segment, and we score them based on a set of factors that are relevant to our client, that measure all of the things that we just discussed. The objective of that is not to find the right answer. The objective of that is to further pare down the field. And so as we're coming out of the second phase of the site selection process, we're hoping to identify those 8, 10 to 12 candidate communities that make the most sense for an in-depth analysis. Whenever I use the term candidate community, that's very broad. Pinellas County, for example, as being a competitive community, is part of the overall Tampa Bay community. And so at this level of analysis, we're looking at it from a very broad perspective. Coming out of the second phase of this, when we're identifying those that warrant an in-depth analysis, that's essentially what we're doing in the third phase. That is when the role of economic development and a lot of folks in this room become critically important. Because in the third phase, that's when we're leaning on local resources to gather real-time data. That's when we're meeting with existing employers to understand what it's really like to operate a business in that particular community. We're talking to the utility providers to understand capacity and cost issues. We're starting to have the initial discussions with economic developers, colleges and universities, and gathering all of that information. At the conclusion of that third phase is when, again, is not to find the optimal location, but it's to further pare the list down to identify those communities that warrant on-site due diligence. That's typically when we're bringing our client team to the community. We're spending a couple of days in the community doing everything we need to do to hopefully make a final decision of where this particular project's going. And sometimes that's often multiple trips to the community. That's things like real estate tours and face-to-face meetings with a lot of the parties I was talking about. We're starting to engage in the third phase of this. And then commences the negotiations from a real estate and incentives perspective. At the conclusion of phase 5, that's when you get your glamorous announcement of this project's going here, they're creating this amount of jobs and capital investment, and then the real work starts for us, which is economic incentive compliance. And basically what that means is we help our clients for the life of an incentive package actually realize those dollars. The last thing I want to touch on before we break for lunch here is the typical project flow. So we talked about what drives projects, the process that's used to identify the optimal location. But where do projects come from? In our experience, there are two sources of projects from an economic developer's perspective. So if I'm Pinellas County and I'm looking at where are projects going to come from, one of two sources. They're either going to come from some third party that we're labeling as a consultant. That can be a site selection firm such as ourselves. That can be a tax firm, a real estate brokerage firm, sometimes law firms, engineering firms. They have somebody acting on their behalf. The second is the companies doing it themselves. They're kind of vertically integrated, and they feel like they can make this location decision by themselves. The next point of contact is when they start engaging economic development groups. More often than not, site selection group as a company is an exception to what I'm about to say, but more often than not, they start at state economic development. They start with the Enterprise Floridas of the world. That is where the largest source of projects come from. Sometimes they'll skip that step and go to the next, which is the regional economic development groups, a la the Tampa Bay Partnership. There are also ancillary economic development groups that can fill this role as well. Duke Energy is a very good example of another firm that has, or another entity that has a very robust economic development platform. Once they get there, projects are then filtered to the local community, the Pinellas counties of the world. Or they can come directly to the Pinellas counties of the world. I can make a very strong argument based on our experience that of new projects, not obviously expansion or retention projects, but new projects, 90% of the projects that this county will see are going to flow through one of those state or regional economic development organizations. Because that's just how site selection works. And that's the reason that we have this slide is because it's going to become incredibly important as we start talking about your economic development partners, primarily Enterprise Florida, primarily the Tampa Bay Partnership, and their importance from a marketing perspective. And that's why we wanted to cover this. So when we come back from lunch, we're going to get into the actual results. And so again, we felt it was necessary to spend a little bit of time here kind of explaining the process, explaining how we evaluated this, and then we'll get into the nitty and gritty of what all of this means for Pinellas County.